This annual tradition of the State of the Union speech was, of course, started by your predecessor, Mr. Barroso, and perhaps now is a good opportunity. I'm sure the whole House would like to join me in congratulating Mr. Barroso on his new, highly paid job at Goldman Sachs. Isn't it all wonderful? Isn't it? So whatever happens, Mr. Juncker, the big boys, I'm sure, will look after you. Having listened to what you've said this morning, all I can say is I'm pleased we voted to leave. It is clear there are no lessons that are going to be learned from Brexit. Indeed, it was the usual recipe, more Europe. And in this particular case, of course, more military Europe, a European army, a common defence, and already in this House people saying, well, the Americans won't be here anymore, we'll have to stand alone with our own military structures. I don't know about a project of peace. I would have thought this is probably a very dangerous move. And it isn't going to change the rapid growth in opposition parties across the whole of Europe. It isn't going to stop the Central and Eastern European countries from saying no to Mrs. Merkel's migrant quotas. And I think you've got a lot more referendums to look forward to. But in terms of Brexit, well, you're probably right to be slightly critical of the British government, who, I agree, ought to get on with it. But it's pretty clear that the EU is getting on with it, and you have already appointed your divorce lawyers. And on behalf of the European Parliament, we've got Guy Verhofstadt. He's the man who's going to be negotiating Brexit. And if you were to think of this building as a temple, well, Mr. Verhofstadt is the high priest, a fanatic. In fact, there is only one real nationalist in the room, and it's you. Because you want flags, anthems, armies. You are an EU nationalist. And I frankly think that this appointment amounts to pretty much a declaration of war on any sensible negotiating process. If you stick to the dogma of saying that for tariff-free access, to reciprocal tariff-free access with the single market, we must maintain the free movement of people, then you will inevitably drive us towards no deal. No deal and trading on WTO rules. For the United Kingdom, that actually isn't too bad, because it's very much better and cheaper than the current deal we've got. But for hundreds of thousands of German car workers and French wine producers, potentially it's very bad news, because we are their biggest market, who they trade with most profitably in the world. And I would argue that what we really need is to have a sensible, common sense approach, and for this Parliament to recognise that it's made a mistake, and to find somebody who actually likes the United Kingdom to lead these talks.
Have expressed their view by universal suffrage, and obviously the majority view of the British people demands respect. Democracy is democracy, and we must respect it. We must respect British democracy and the way it has voiced its view.
That's the last time you are applauding here. And to some extent, I'm really surprised that you are here. You were fighting for the exit. The British people voted in favour of the exit. Why are you here?
Now, because that's where the Prime Minister has been facing his fellow European leaders for the first time since that vote last week, the vote for the UK to leave the EU. And I can join my colleague Christian Fraser, who's there. Christian.
Sammy, thank you very much. Yes, the Prime Minister is sitting down face-to-face with the other European leaders for the first time, of course, since the referendum vote on Thursday. And tonight they'll sit down for dinner and talk specifically about Brexit. And it might well be an uncomfortable dinner for him, because there will be frustration in the room. Back in February, he convinced many of them that he could win this referendum on the renegotiation he'd secured. But of course, that's not the way it's turned out. And I dare say there might not be an awful lot of polite dinner conversation. We shall see. Well, I'm very pleased to say that the UKIP leader, Nigel Farage, has joined me after your fun and games in the European Parliament this morning. You seem to enjoy yourself. I mean, some might ask whether it's the right approach to take them on head on when we're looking for a constructive negotiation.
Well, my argument was, let's be grown up. Let's recognise that trade between each of us really matters. But ultimately, if you decide to cut off your noses to spite your faces, it'll hurt you more than it will hurt us. I was attempting to have a serious conversation. I just happened to be the pantomime villain of the day. A lot of people there very upset about Brexit because they want to build a United States of Europe. And what I saw today convinced me that the referendum result was the right one.
You were just saying to me off camera, you think they're more worried than they're actually showing here.
They're very worried, and the worry is not the UK. The worry is that in Denmark, the Netherlands and other countries around Europe, suddenly the opinion polls say that referendums there on staying members of the Union look like 50-50. So there is a feeling tonight in Brussels that maybe the project is about to collapse.
Would you accept that on the Leave side there's been a certain amount of drift in the last 2 or 3 days? I mean, you were out banging the drum, but we've not seen much of Boris Johnson or Michael Gove. England lost last night, so the English electorate is a bit down in the mouth. Generally, there is a sense of depression descending across the country.
Well, I never thought I'd say this, but I rather agreed with what Mr. Juncker said this morning, the European Commission President. He said, look, you voted to leave. I disagree with it. I don't like it, but I respect democratic decisions. So let's get on and implement it. And actually, that's right. Because if we're going to wait for a successor to David Cameron, further thinking, and we're not going to invoke Article 50 or start the serious renegotiation of our trade relationship until later on this year, actually that is a period of indecision, and that can't be good for anybody. So I'm now of the view that we should trigger Article 50. Let's get cracking. Let's change our relationship with Europe. Not being members of political union, but having a sensible trade deal and being good next door neighbours.
The problem for many on the Remain side and people here in Europe is that everyone's talking about having their cake and eat it. Boris Johnson's talking about the single market and not having freedom of movement. You're talking about a free trade agreement and no freedom of movement. How are we going to get around that when they're adamant that if you want these accesses to the European market, you've got to play by the rules?
Well, let's get one thing clear. We keep being told, as we were in the referendum campaign, about access to the single market. You know, you can't have access to the single market, we're told, without free movement or without paying contributions. Rubbish. Every single country in the world has access to a single market. The question is, what are those terms of access? Now, 40 years ago, my parents' generation voted to stay part of a common market, which gave us tariff-free access to the European market in a world of high tariffs, a world of big barriers. Because of globalisation, because of change over 40 years, those tariffs are now so small that our costs of membership outweigh any benefits we get from it. We'd be better off with no deal at all, and World Trade Organization rules. What I try to argue this morning in the European Parliament is that unless we have a sensible deal, a sensible, simple free trade agreement between us, there are hundreds of thousands of German car workers that might lose their jobs.
But you're talking about a sort of system like we're a Singapore outside Europe with low corporate tax rates, with all the benefits of free trade, but none of the rules that apply to the rest, and they're just not going to allow us to do that.
Well, the point about free trade, as opposed to membership of this political customs union, is when you trade freely with each other, that's what you do. You just remove tariff barriers. You don't do anything else. And that's what I want our relationship to be with the European Union. And they may huff and puff a bit to begin with, but they'll recognise one thing. We are the Eurozone's biggest trading partner in the world. They sell us £70 billion of the goods every year, more than we sell them. And there's a German general election next year. If the German car industry thinks it's about to lose 500,000 jobs, Mrs. Merkel will lose. In the end, economic pragmatism and tough negotiation can win us the right relationship.
Okay, just a final question on Jeremy Corbyn. Only has the support of 40 of his MPs. Doesn't look as if he's going to be going anywhere because the membership is on his side. Is that a problem for the negotiation as a whole? It needs to be cross-party, doesn't it?
Well, I would like the negotiation to be cross-party, although the indications from Vote Leave and the Conservatives are that they'd rather do it themselves. I think there are three Labour parties. There's a parliamentary Labour Party, which is Blairite Social Democratic. There's a Labour Party membership, which is Corbynite, and half their voters are more UKIP than Labour. They're in a terrible mess.
You seem to be saying goodbye to the European Parliament today. You put your flat up for rent.
Well, I will only engage here, between now and us finally leaving, when there is something I can say in that Parliament that directly affects our negotiations. So, yeah, I'm on a wind down.
Norman Smith is there. Wow, Norman, what does this mean?
This is potentially a massive blow to Theresa May's Brexit plans, because the Lord Chief Justice says he wasn't taking a position in terms of whether we should be in or outside the EU. Purely on a point of law, he rejected the government's argument that the government should trigger Article 50. In other words, it should be left to ministers to decide when we leave the EU. Instead, he backed the claimant's case, which was no, it should be Parliament that decides. Now, that opens up a nightmare scenario for the government. Potentially, it means that Parliament could have to pass legislation to trigger Article 50. And if that was the case, the whole process could last for months and months and months, because it wouldn't just have to go through the Commons, it would have to go through the House of Lords too, where the government does not have a majority and where there are an overwhelming number of peers opposed to Brexit. On top of that, to add to the government's potential nightmare is the possibility that MPs could seek to amend that legislation to put in all sorts of conditions on Brexit. For example, they might insist that MPs should have another vote on Theresa May's negotiating strategy. Perhaps they might put in an amendment saying that we should remain a part of the single market. This has thrown one almighty spanner in the works for Theresa May. The one glimmer the government will hang on to is the possibility of going to the Supreme Court to appeal against this decision. But at the moment, I would think in Downing Street, they're holding their head in their hands thinking, what do we do now?
And on that, is it clear that they will have leave to appeal to the Supreme Court?
Oh yeah, this is such a huge constitutional issue. They will have automatic right to leapfrog the Court of Appeal and go straight to the Supreme Court. Here's one little quirk, though. It is possible, though unlikely, that the final decision could be taken by the European Court of Justice. Now, that would be an extraordinary scenario where our future in Europe was determined by the European Court. So I think no one is going to want to do that, although legally that would be possible. But I would imagine there will be an appeal unless the government decide, OK, let's just go for the vote quickly and see if we can do it on a simple, what's called substantive motion, a one-off vote in the House of Commons. It gets a little bit complicated, but the two scenarios that seem to me to be appearing before the government is, can they just hold a one-off substantive vote in the House of Commons as sufficient to show Parliament has been consulted, or, as the claimants argue, they have to introduce legislation. In other words, there has to be an Article 50 bill, which could take months and months and months, probably delayed triggering Article 50, maybe until, 2018, who knows? And also opening up the option of a whole load of difficult and awkward amendments being chucked in, making the process of Brexit much, much harder. So the key thing now is, could the government go for a quick vote, or are they going to get bogged down in legislation?
And when you say could they go for a quick vote, would it be that simple? How are MPs likely to respond, if and when they do get a vote?
No, here's the funny thing, Joanna. The vote is not the problem. I know that sounds a bit odd, but the reason is this. Most MPs will vote to trigger Article 50, because not to do so would be to spit in the face of the electorate. So even MPs who are committed Remainers, opposed to Brexit, even a large number of them, would vote to trigger Article 50. The issue is the way that vote is held. If it is held as a short, sharp shock vote in the next few weeks or a couple of months, then the government will probably win it, and Theresa May can stick to a timetable of triggering Article 50 by the end of March. If, however, the judges rule that there has to be legislation, then the government will have to bring forward a bill to enact Article 50. Now, legislation takes months to get through Parliament. It is hugely convoluted, problematic. It is a gift to opponents. So the issue, as I say, is not the vote, but how the vote is going to be carried out, either as a short, sharp, substantive motion or a long, protracted, difficult, messy, painful piece of legislation.
Stage following the European Union referendum has been to respect the outcome of that referendum and to ensure it's delivered on. To leave the European Union was a decision of the British people. It was taken after a 6-1 vote in this House to put that decision in their hands. As the government told the voters, this is your decision. The government will implement what you decide. No ifs, no buts. So there can be no going back. The point of no return was passed on June 23rd. Implementing the decision to leave the EU means following the right processes. We must leave in the way agreed in law by the UK and other member states, which means following the process set out in Article 50 of the Treaty on the European Union. And we've been clear about the timing. There was a good reason the government did not take the advice of some in this House on the 24th of June and trigger Article 50 immediately. Instead, the Prime Minister was clear that she would not invoke Article 50 before the end of this year. This is giving us time to develop a detailed negotiating position. But we've also said that the process should not drag on, and we intend to trigger Article 50 by the end of March next year. Let me now turn to the issues at hand this week. Legal action was taken to challenge the government on the proper process for triggering Article 50. We've always been of the clear view this is a matter for the government, that it's constitutionally proper and lawful to give effect to the referendum result by the use of prerogative powers. As I have said, the basis on which the referendum was held was the government would give effect to the result of that referendum. That was the basis on which people were asked to vote. Our argument in the High Court was that decisions on the making and withdrawal from treaties are clear examples of the use of the royal prerogative, and that Parliament, while having a role in the process, which I'll come to, has not constrained the use of the prerogative to withdraw from the EU. Our position in the case was therefore the government was entitled to invoke the procedure set out in Article 50. The court has, however, come to a different view and held that the government does not have the prerogative power to give notice under Article 50 without legislation authorising it to do so. The court said the starting point was the Crown does not have power to vary the law of the land using its prerogative powers unless Parliament legislated to the contrary. It held that the European Communities Act 1972 brought rights arising under EU law into the law of the United Kingdom, and that the Crown has no prerogative power to withdraw from the EU because the effect of withdrawal would be to take away those rights. Let me be clear about this. We believe in and value the independence of our judiciary, the foundation upon which our rule of law I have to say, the opposition, I have a little more background in protecting that independence than they have, given their previous government. We also value the freedom of our press. Both these things underpin our democracy. Now, the government disagrees with the court's judgment. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by an act of Parliament. Our position remains that the only means of leaving is through the procedure set out in Article 50, and that triggering Article 50 is properly a matter for the government using its prerogative powers. We will appeal, as a result, the High Court's judgment at the Supreme Court. Now, given our appeal, it would not be appropriate to comment further on the details of the legal arguments, and I'm sure the House will understand this. But let me say a brief word about the process of the appeal. We have taken two necessary procedural steps. First, the government has been granted a certificate to bypass the Court of Appeal and leapfrog the case to the Supreme Court. This will ensure that when we lodge our appeal, it will be heard directly in the Supreme Court without further delay in the courts. Second, we will this week apply for the substantive permission to appeal to the Supreme Court. It's likely that any hearing will be scheduled in the Supreme Court in early December. We would hope the judgment will be provided soon after. This timetable remains consistent with our aim to trigger Article 50 by the end of March next year. We are now preparing our submission to the Supreme Court in the usual way. As I said, it would not be proper to go into those in great detail here today. But the core of our argument will remain that we believe that it's proper and lawful for the government to trigger Article 50 by the use of prerogative powers. Of course, there's also litigation underway in Northern Ireland. This is considering a number of specific issues linked to Northern Ireland's constitutional arrangements. The High Court in Belfast found in the government's favour on these points. A hearing in Belfast is being held tomorrow to consider whether an appeal by the claimants in this case should also leapfrog the Supreme Court, and whether the issues that overlap the English courts should remain stayed pending the outcome of the Supreme Court. Again, it would not be appropriate for me to say more on this at that stage, except to say that in the event of any appeal in the Northern Ireland litigation, the government will robustly defend its position. And for the avoidance of doubt, our view is that the legal timetable in relation to this case, in the event of an appeal, should also be consistent with our commitment to notifying under Article 50 by the end of March next year. Now, I said that because of our appeal, I will not go into detail on the points raised here, raised in the High Court's judgment, but let me set out some fundamental principles for how we move ahead. First of all, our plan remains to invoke Article 50 by the end of March. We believe the legal timetable will allow for that. Second, the referendum result must be respected and delivered. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum provided for by an Act of Parliament. There must be no attempts to remain inside the EU, no attempts to rejoin it through the back door, no second referendum. The country voted to leave the European Union. It's a duty of the government to make sure we do just that. Parliament had its say in legislating for the referendum, which it did in both houses with overwhelming majorities in this House and cross-party support. The people have spoken. We intend to act on their decision. Third, irrespective of the ongoing court process, there is an important role for Parliament. Parliament will have a central role in making sure we find the best way forward, and we've been clear we'll be as transparent and open as possible. There have already been a number of debates and parliamentary statements on Brexit, and the Prime Minister's pledge that process will continue before Article 50 is invoked. I informed the House in October that there will be a series of debates on Brexit in government time. The first of those is this afternoon. This is on top of a number of other debates and opportunities for scrutiny. The new Select Committee on Exiting the EU has been established. This provides another place for parliamentary scrutiny of our withdrawal from the EU, and the committee, I think, will be visiting my department tomorrow, if I remember correctly. The government will bring forward legislation next session that, when enacted, will repeal the European Communities Act on the day we leave the EU. This great repeal bill will end the authority of EU law and return power to the United Kingdom. And we have been clear, European Union law will be transposed into UK law at the time we leave, providing certainty for workers, businesses and consumers. This will be an Act of Parliament which we intend to have in place before the end of the Article 50 process. It's important to remember that Article 50 is the beginning of the process, it's not the end. As the Prime Minister has made clear, there will be many opportunities for Parliament to continue to engage with government once Article 50 has been invoked. And when negotiations are concluded, we will observe in full all relevant legal and constitutional obligations that apply. But there is a balance to be struck between parliamentary scrutiny and preserving our negotiating position, which is why the House unanimously concluded last month that the process should be undertaken in such a way that respects the decision of the people of the United Kingdom when they voted to leave the EU on 23rd of June and does not undermine the negotiating position of the government as negotiations are entered into. And will give no quarter to anyone who, while going through the motions of respecting the outcome of the referendum, in fact seeks to thwart the decision of the British people. So, to conclude, we are disappointed by the court's judgment in this case. We will appeal that judgment to the Supreme Court, and none of this in any way diminishes our determination to respect and deliver on the outcome of the referendum to notify under Article 50 by the end of March next year. We're going to get on with delivering on the mandate to leave the European Union the best possible way for the UK's national interest, best for jobs, best for growth and best for investment.
You have talked about a moneyed elite betraying the will of the people. Are you talking about Gina here? Miller?
Oh, very much so, yeah. Although, don't forget, I've been in the European Parliament for years, so I've seen this happen all over Europe. I've seen the Danes forced to vote again, the Irish forced to vote again, the Dutch and French ignored. There is a political and wealthy ruling elite who are not prepared to accept the democratic result of referendums.
You've been an insurgent all your political life. Do you not at least admire Gina Miller here for using her own money to change things? I mean, nobody asked her to do this. She used her own money. She went to the House of Lords, she went to the courts, and she has now changed our entire political structure.
Well, Parliament has to have a vote. and she's done what she believes in. I, of course, support people doing what they believe in. However, I just want to ask her, what part of the word leave don't you understand?
This case, have you read the case?
Yes, and you're arguing
Yes.
that Parliament should have a say. But do you want us, ultimately, OK, you accept we're leaving the European Union, do you want us to stay part of the single market?
I'm not the politician. I'm not the politician here. I'm the person who saw the elephant in the room, which was there is no legal certainty. You should actually be my biggest fan, because I've just created the legal certainty so that Theresa May can now, rather than appealing, go ahead, have the debate and leave, not interrupt her timetable. So actually, there is legal certainty.
But what you've done is you've given all those in Parliament who argue that the referendum does not mean we should leave the single market, you've given them the chance, effectively, to overturn the Prime Minister's wish and to mandate her. And if that happens, you would have stirred up, I think, the biggest political upset we've ever seen.
So should we sack all the MPs and they go home? Because
what do
we
you know
have
what?
a representative democracy at the moment, which means that they have to go in there and debate. That's what Parliament was. That's what you argued for the whole way through,
I've argued
which was
for
parliamentary sovereignty.
No,
Exactly.
I don't. No. This is not about whether Parliament's sovereign. It's about whether the British people are sovereign. That's the real argument.
We are not
here.
a direct
And for you, as a pro-EU supporter, to talk about parliamentary sovereignty in Britain is a bit rich, isn't it? Really.
Will we move on? Do you want a country where we have no process, where everything we do in life, being buying a house...
It's called a referendum. We've had a referendum.
If Parliament wanted to, the Referendum Act would not have said it was advisory. The politicians lied all the way through, because they didn't say that.
I take the advisory point, and I would now wish to see constitutional change to make referendums binding. And that then would end this argument, and there'd be no need for this case.
Do you think there now needs to be another general... If Brexit is sort of stuck inside the House of Commons and the House of Lords, we haven't even talked about the Lords for a while, do you think there needs to be another general election?
Yes, I think that if Parliament was to effectively try and mandate the Prime Minister to try and keep us inside the single market, I don't think Theresa May would have any choice but to go to the country for a spring general election, and she could do so on a very clear ticket, win a big majority. The House of Lords problem, there are 104 Liberal Democrat life peers who appear to be pledged to delaying the process as much as possible.
And this could be peers as well.
I mean, this could be the end of the House of Lords. Yeah.
Seriously, so you're stirring up huge things here, Gina Miller.
I think that Nigel's point on referendum and where is the place of referendum in our political system is a very valid one. But that's not where we exist now. It's about the rule of law where we are now. That is a very valid point about the whole political system being looked at.
Yeah,
because it all needs changing. And that's the hatred that's really there. And that's the hatred I completely understand in the people, is that nobody trusts the politicians because the majority of the ones who are the main decision makers lie.
But we always used to trust the judges, and apparently we don't trust the judges now either.
I think that is unforgivable, because they are not, I'm a nobody. They are the biggest brains in this country. They are what make us great. And then, no, I'm sorry, but the reason you...
Well, I'm not very happy. I mean, there is a willful attempt by a very dishonest political class to overthrow one of the major aspects of the referendum. Both sides made it clear, if we voted to leave, we were leaving the single market. And I now sense there's a majority in Parliament that, despite that vote, want to keep us in the single market with free movement of people.
But the High Court ruling, in essence, was quite simple, and I suppose is following the rules. And part of the whole campaign for Brexit was that we wanted British rules, British justice for British people. And in a sense, this is part of it, isn't it? We've got to accept what our judges are telling us.
Well, I'm not so sure I have confidence in the independence of our judiciary anymore. I mean, look, a Prime Minister needs to be able to make decisions, and morally, the country has voted. My concern is that if we put this back into the House of Commons, into the hands of our political class, frankly, we risk being betrayed.
OK, let's speak to Stephen Kinnock about that, because, Stephen, of course, you were on the other side of the campaign. You vehemently campaigned to remain. Despite that, your constituents voted that they wanted to leave. Nigel Farage thinks there's a willful attempt here to derail what is happening in and the majority's choice to leave Europe. When it comes down to it, would you vote against triggering Article 50?
No, I wouldn't. I'd be absolutely clear. I did campaign passionately for Remain, but I believe absolutely that the people have spoken. We must leave the European Union. And if I were presented just with a binary question in Parliament, would you now, tomorrow, trigger Article 50 or not, I would absolutely vote to trigger it. I just think that would be a real missed opportunity. What we voted for is to, take back control, which was at the heart of the Leave campaign, and that means Parliament, the British Parliament, being sovereign, having an opportunity to debate these incredibly important issues about our future relationship with the rest of the European Union.
Isn't that part of the problem,
we've taken
though?
Since the Second World War.
Yeah, Stephen Kinnock, isn't that part of the problem, though, that now those 17.4 million people who voted for it will be feeling this morning, is that, hang on a minute, that there were 480 MPs out of 600 odd who were Remainers. So if this goes into Parliament now, if the Supreme Court upholds this ruling, that actually there will be essentially filibustering, there will be people bringing up amendments, there will be, at best, there will be a great watering down of what Brexit means because of the power that these MPs will now have, in a sense, over the rights and the will of the people who have already spoken.
Well, I just hope that people will trust Parliament. I think this is an opportunity to start rebuilding some trust between our democratically elected institutions and the rest of the country. And it's going to be up to Theresa May to show that leadership, that she's ready to start reuniting the country. The best way to do that is trust Parliament to have a sober debate, a constructive debate, which is about helping to give Theresa May a stronger mandate as she goes into these negotiations. I don't know how many times I have to say it. I believe that Article 50 has to be triggered. I will vote for the triggering of Article 50, but I also believe that there's due process here for our sovereign Parliament, and that's what we voted for on the 23rd of June.
Let's go back to Nigel Farage then, because Mr Farage, from your perspective, you understand that actually in terms of mandate, and Stephen Kinnock talking about that Theresa May needs to be trusted, you'd quite like to see Theresa May call a snap election, which in theory would allow her, if the polls are to be believed, although often polls can be wrong, polls to be believed, she would get a stronger mandate because she'd have more MPs.
Yeah, I mean, it's all well and good, Stephen Kinnock saying trust us. Believe me, Mr. Kinnock, we don't. And whilst I accept that you will vote to trigger Article 50, I suspect that you're one of those MPs who thinks that we should not be leaving the single market. And that's why I don't trust Parliament on this. The neatest, cleanest way to finish this off is for May to call a general election on the basis that Brexit means Brexit, to get a majority and to get on with it. The problem is that the previous Parliament put through the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, and to get that through, she would need the support of Labour MPs. So we are in a bit of a pickle, and I really do think that you should not underestimate just how angry those 17.4 million people are going to be if Brexit doesn't really mean Brexit.
Will try and cause as much division in all the other political parties as I possibly can.
Thank you very much, Mr. Farage.
Thank you.